We've got Parshas Acharei Mos. So there's really three parts to the parsha. The first part is to do with Yom Kippur, Avodas Yom Kippurim. A few days after Pesach, very hard to get into the Yom Kippur mood. There is then a section in the middle dealing with Achilas Dam, a few other Isurim, and then the second part of the parsha, also to do with Yom Kippur, is the Arayas, the Parshas Arayas. And there's an interesting five pasukim, a famous five pasukim, which introduces the parsha of Arayas. Rather than it launching into the list of Arayas and the Isurim, the Torah gives us an introduction. I just wanted to analyze two points here. We'll see pasuk Gimel and pasuk Daled, and the time we have to suggest and to bring a few approaches. Perhaps some of them we are familiar with, but many perhaps not so familiar and important points. So let's read together. Parshas Perek Yudches and Parshas Acharei Mos. Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Leimo. Hashem speaks to Moshe, saying, Daber al bnei Yisrael, shall speak to bnei Yisrael, v'amartu aleim, and shall say to them, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. I am Hashem, your God. Again, interesting here in the middle of Sefer Vayikra that it's introduced with this proclamation, declaration, I am Hashem. Like the actions, like the deeds of the land of Egypt, that you dwelt in it. Interesting addition, that you dwelt in it. Our Chaim asks, Kliyakar asks, they knew where they were. They spent 210 years in Mitzrayim. We'll see both have approaches to this additional phrase, Asher Yeshavtem Bo. You should not do. And similarly, like the acts or the deeds of the land of Canaan that you're coming there, you should not do. And in their statutes you shall not go. So it's both their deeds and their chukosayim and their statutes. We'll see the Emek Dava picks up on this duplication. Pasuk Dalet, rather as mishpatai tasu, my laws you shall do, my judgments, as chukosai tishmoru, and my statutes you shall guard. Lo leches bahem, to go in them. Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am Hashem your God. Ushmartim es chukosai ves mishpatai. Here is interestingly a repetition, and as the Emek Dava we'll see at the end, is a switching around. Pasuk Dalet, there's mishpat taitas, so usually it's mishpat, judgments, and then chukim. Mishpatim, as we understand, usually those things we understand, they're logical. Chukim, those things are illogical, and it's a progression. You're going to do those things that make sense. Those things that, had the Torah not written them, we would have done them anyway. Stealing, murder, adultery, whatever, maybe. Chukim, those things which are unique to our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that with their statutes, they're not comprehensible to the human mind. We won't do this progression. Interesting, Pasuk Hey, it flips it. Ushmartim es chukosai, I should guard my statutes. Es mishpatai, as and my judgments. Ashayach eldom, that a man should do them. V'chai bahem, and he should live by them. Ani Hashem. Yeah, really interesting introduction. Then he goes into the Arayas. I am Hashem. Not to do like the deeds of Mitzrayim, not to do the deeds of Canaan, rather to keep my statutes, keep my mishpatim, in both orders. What's going on here? Then v'chai we're not going to go in that. Famously, v'chai to live by the mitzvahs, not to die by the mitzvah. We should die at Kiddush Hashem, but v'chai that Torah is that the life is nidchel, the mitzvah Shabbat Torah. A famous sugi. Look at Rashi. Rashi he says, "Kamai se'eres Mitzrayim, magi shemasem shel Mitzrayim v'shel Canaan yemukulu kolim mikol umas." Why does the Torah have to introduce? No, it doesn't tell us keep Shabbos. Don't do like the Englishmen or like the Americans. No. Why introduce it? Why frame it by mentioning Mitzrayim and Canaan? So the Rashi tells us famously that the deeds of Egypt and the deeds of Canaan were the most decrepit and immoral of all the nations. And therefore, the places that the Jews, the Klal Yisrael live, whether Mitzrayim or they're going to Canaan, were the worst, and nonetheless, the meaning it's in reference to, don't do like those around you, simply don't be influenced. You've seen how they live their lives, particularly immoral lives. Don't be influenced. You're going to live a distinct and different life. Basically, they're used as a foil. They're used as a negative example. Rav Soloveitchik saw it in the Chumash, the first of Chumash, path this out a little bit. And I think it's important to see. So, right, the contrast between Israel and the rest of mankind is emphasized to an extreme in this section. The key message of this particular passage in the Torah is this introductory verse. Israel is separate and distinct from the nations surrounding her. We must uphold this unique identity. Under no conditions are we to consider assimilation. So this is interesting. Now, Egypt and Canaan are mentioned specifically. So why these two nations? It's all nations. because these nations represent the two poles of secular civilizations in biblical times. Egypt was the most urbanized and technologically advanced civilization of the time, while Canaan was pastoral and primitive. The Torah emphasizes that as different as they were from each other, neither of these fundamentally immoral societies should serve as role models. We lived in Mitzrayim, the highest level of civilization. We can see it from what they had built with the pyramids and the irrigation systems and the whole economy that Yosef built was very, very advanced. The West of today, very, very advanced. They had a certain immorality. You might say, well, Jews should be therefore attracted to the very simple society, the agrarian societies. Canaan was a backwater. Says Resolvation. No, the Torah says Canaan also had its immorality. The answer is not necessarily to be attracted or to try to mimic one type of economic model or the other, to live in a very advanced society or very backward society. And we see Jewish communities have tried both, and it doesn't necessarily work. It's not within the economic setups or the advancements or not lack of advancements, but can be immoral in either way. So look at the Emek Davis has a different approach. He says, again, why this whole introduction before the Parshas Acharei? He says, because and this is also very, very contemporary. He says there are two reasons why people do Averis, or two frames. It could be just the immense drive of the desires that pushes a person to break forth from the normative laws either of Torah or either even what a person knows is good for them. They know that engaging in this immoral behavior will break their life, their reputation, their family. Nonetheless, people do it. It's not called a halicha, it's not called a path, it's not called a direction, it's not something which is b'shita. Rather, it's nice, it's incongruous, and it's a disparate act. That's why it says like the acts of the lands of Egypt, meaning individual acts that person might do. It doesn't create, it's not their life, it's not their worldview, it's rather the urges that overcome them. But the second reason why a person might engage in immoral behavior is this is the law of the land, or this is the norms of a society, and therefore you simply follow the norms of those around you. And people break the Torah, they disgrace or they fall short of the mitzvahs. It's not because of their desire only, or even, but rather because that is the minhag, that is the customary behavior around them. Therefore introduces it with the deeds of its Egypt, that you see that these people, they're just living a wanton free life. That's in the Yetzirah overcome them. Don't do like them. And then he also goes on, it must be cut off here, that but then there's also societies where it's not just simply people are being put together, they're just living free moral lives. It's now become like the stat, it's become the law of the land. It's the whole society is set up like that. And that is the second part of the pasuk of even if it's become like the normative moral, zeitgeist of where you're living, even then it's not permissible. And the Torah Tamima quotes, I think he's quoting from the Toras Chaim. Similar thing. So if you say it does like the deeds, it just simply says you should not do like the man of Mitzvah. What does that mean? They have building laws, or they have certain ways of agriculture. You're not allowed to do them. Just because a non-Jew does something, you're not allowed to do that. That's not what it means. In their laws, in their statutes, you shall not go. There's the deeds, which we saw in the Emek Dava was don't follow the deeds, the immoral deeds of those around you. But that's one level. But that's not automatically also for us to mimic the deeds if they got good deeds. But there's a second element here with that laws, but they become entrenched as laws. If they're evil, immoral laws, then that as well you cannot follow. The Ramban will skip. Because the Ramban again quotes the Ibn Ezra that perhaps Kamaisi Eretz Mitzrayim is not referring to immorality, or referring to Avodah Zarah, Hasira and Niskarim, and Eretz Canaan is Arayos, but he rejects this. The Kliyok has a completely different approach. Kliyok says the introduction of Kamaisi Eretz Mitzrayim, Asher Yeshavtem Ba, or Kamaisi Eretz Canaan is nothing to do with the Arayos. It's actually a separate prohibition altogether. There's two separate things here. It doesn't say it. It doesn't say twice loisasu, but rather it's loisasu is on both of them. Sorry, since it says it's twice, this is not two examples. The is saying this is not just the Torah is giving hyperbole, that is sort of trying to dramatize it. You're coming to Eretz Yisrael, you've just left Egypt, we don't want you to do arayas. These are the places you might learn to do arayas from. These are examples. The Torah is not simply telling that. In fact, it repeats it twice. Loisas. There seems to be two distinct loisasis. What are they? So this is very interesting. Look at the Kliyakar. Rather, the Torah is finding the Bnei Yisrael guilty. When he says, like the deed of Eretz Mitzrayim, it's not about the Egyptians. The deed of Eretz Mitzrayim is the deed of the Jews in Eretz Mitzrayim. And what is the deed? What is the Aveira of the Jews in Eretz Mitzrayim? Asher yeshavtem ba, that you dwelt in it, that you didn't want to leave. Kamosh Pirashin Lamala back in the Kidiyaka, Slay Parshas Vayigash, Laposu Vayishri Yisrael Be'eretz Koshen. שבאשמס יסוד ידבר, והאשמים אליקים אשר ביקשו ליישב ישיבה של קבע במקום אשר אמר אליקים להם כי יש שם גירים לא תשב. So there's nothing to do with the arayas. Is telling the Jewish people at this point, don't ever make the same mistake of Eretz Mitzrayim, that what? Asher yeshavtem ba, that you wanted to live in it permanently, that you didn't want to leave it. We famously, many Jews died in the plague of darkness. He brings that here. Basically, the Jews didn't want to leave the Golus. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had told them from the outset it was only ever supposed to be temporary. On the next page, why? So why did the Jews want to stay in Egypt? They were slaves after all. Because you enjoyed, you wanted, you became attached to their worldview, to their polytheistic, idolatrous worldview, and that you wanted to stay there and be associated with that. And so it says, what's a separate thing? What's the deed of Eretz Canaan that you shouldn't do? Inappropriate for the days coming up. Kadosh Baruch Hu is saying here, he's finding them guilty that they despise the Holy Land. That the forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, was beloved to them. They were Moshe Nefesh on Eretz Yisrael. But the Jewish people in the time of the Midbar, they despised it. That God had to bring us to Eretz Yisrael against our will, which wasn't good for us. And that is really it's nothing to do with the Arai. It's interesting for the Kliyakar. This pasuk, Canaan, is here the Jews living in this in-between stage in the Midbar, is telling Klal Yisrael never again fall short, do the sin of Eretz Mitzrayim, which you wanted to live there permanently when it wasn't supposed to be for you, and neither repeat the sin ever again of Eretz Canaan, again. It says that I'm bringing you there, Baal Karcham, against their will. God had to force them to come into the land of Canaan because they despised it. And the third approach is of that of the Orach Chaim. Really, again, a radical point here of the Orach Chaim. The Orach Chaim writes, look at the Orach Chaim. Why the introduction? He asked a few questions, but questions will become apparent through the answers from the piece I've brought here. Why again the introduction to the Arayos? Why this whole prologue? He says all the commandments that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, he gave us the ability to withstand them. All the Averos that he prohibited to us, he gave us the ability to be able to withstand them. Zulas mitzvahs perishas harayos, except from removing ourselves from sexual immorality. This is really incredible, these things. He says, a person desires them deeply, so much so, we literally become like an onus. It becomes out of our control. We transgress them in a way involuntary. There's only two tricks, two aids that give us the ability to overcome. And what are they? To get it out of sight, to basically not ever be presented with the challenge to begin with, and also to distance it from our thoughts, really to make it into something which is totally foreign, totally unthinkable to us. And if you don't do these two things, keep it out of sight and keep it out of mind, so to speak, it's impossible to overcome the urge. It's impossible to ensure you won't transgress this kadra, this slew of Averis of Arayis. Because both ways, if it's on your mind, you're going to do it, and even if it's off your mind, once you see it, it will once again reignite the thoughts. And now he comes into why the introduction of Eretz Mitzrayim and Eretz Canaan. So he has to present these Averis in a certain way, in a clever way, in a way that's going to make it possible for us to be able to keep these Averis, or meaning to not transgress them. How can a human being, a natural person, overcome his desires? Because what's the answer? Only, as he gave an introduction, you're able to keep them out of sight and keep them out of mind. Let's just skip a few words. Okay, there's Kamaisi Eretz Mitzrayim. There's that. Yeah. It's in the second paragraph, about 5 lines down. Pirush. Even though, so now HaKadosh Baruch has to prefix. He said, "Look, I understand. Our eyes are nearly impossible to not transgress them, and the only answer is to keep them out of sight and keep them out of mind. Yet, Eretz Mitzrayim, Asher Yeshavtem Ba, how's it possible for you as a people who have lived in the very place that you saw it up close? You lived in a place ensconced in a land of immorality, in a land of arayos. Therefore, it's impossible for you to not be able to contemplate it, for you to not have it on your mind. It's imprinted within your psyche. It's part of your national identity. It's part of the formation of who you were as a people, being born literally in Mitzrayim. That's why Kodesh Baruch Hu introduces it with Mitzrayim. Even though you lived amongst it, it's part of your consciousness, it's part of your psyche. Nonetheless, I'm commanding you, even so, you have to overcome, even so, you have the transgressions, you have the Averis of our rights. What about Canaan? Why the mention of El Canaan? Pirush. So even if you're now leaving Mitzrayim, it's part of your psyche, but you're not seeing it anymore. You're in a midbar, you're in a wilderness that you're not accosting this regularly. Nonetheless, I'm going to bring you to Eretz Canaan, and you're going to once again see this type of sexual immoral behavior, and therefore it's going to regenerate, it's going to reignite within your psyche, within your minds, the memory of Mitzrayim, of that impression of arayos. Nonetheless, I'm still commanding you, even though you've experienced it in Mitzrayim, it became part of your national psyche, and I'm bringing you now to Eretz Canaan, when once again you're going to witness it, and that's going to reignite the desire for it. Nonetheless, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even so, I'm commanding you, even so, I'm entrusting you, Klal Yisrael, with the ability to overcome. And that's why it says, if you look back in the Pesukim, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, it stresses the fact that you are b'nei Yisrael, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, that I am Hashem your God. Even so, says the Orach Chaim, Arayis is nearly impossible to overcome. The only way you can overcome it is if either that you've never experienced it, it's not really within your realm of possibility. And he says earlier, that's why a Baal Teshuvah is greater, because it's become part of their reality. Arayis is part of reality for them. Since even though for you that's not true because Eretz Mitzrayim, it is part of your reality. And point number 2 is to overcome Arayis is that it's not just out of mind, it's not part of your reality, but it's also out of sight. You're going to go once again to see it in the Eretz Canaan. The second tachmura, the second tactic to overcome is being taken away from you. Nonetheless, all the Arayis, even so, says the Orach Chaim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is commanding us, entrusting with us the ability to overcome. So there were 3 approaches to why Eretz Mitzrayim and Eretz Canaan. You have the Emek Davar, that one is Arayis on a happenstance level. One is when Arayis is baked in to the societal laws or the culture. Number 2 was the Kliyokar, which is nothing to do with Arayis. It's to do with the sins of wanting to dwell, wanting to stay in Mitzrayim, and wanting to not come to Eretz Yisrael. And here the Orach Chaim about why Mitzrayim and Canaan is these 2 approaches, these 2 tools to fight against our eyes are undermined by our experiences in Mitzrayim and Canaan, and nonetheless HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands it to us. In the last few minutes, I want to address the idea of the Chukim and Mishpatim. The Torah twice, Pasuk Dalet and Pasuk Hey, stresses the importance of keeping the Mishpatim and the Chukim. So we usually understand Chukim and Mishpatim, as I mentioned before, those things that can be understood, Mishpatim, and Chukim are those things which are not understood. But Rav Tzvi Hoffman has a novel approach to how he defines Chukim and Mishpatim. So look at this is on the 3rd line here. Yet to do gives the Hagdiras HaMishpatim, because the Chiyos Kedinim HaKrive Mes HaYachsim Shebinad Machtaveira. Rabbi, the Mishpatim should really be understood as laws that govern the relationship between us and our fellow humans. Vidu HaChukim, and the Chukim Mitzayim HaChobeis B'negei Adam La'atzmo. Those are not necessarily incomprehensible things in the Torah, but rather those are the mitzvahs or the laws that govern the relationship between man and himself. So the Mishpatim, the interpersonal laws, don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery, those things that govern societal behavior. Chukim are those things, or if you look, there are things that govern personal, personal behavior within oneself. They govern how we create a holy body and a pure soul. And more extensively, it's between the relationship not just between man and himself, but man and nature. Chukim, shatnez, kilayim, other types of statutes that ensure that there is a congruity, there's a nature is upheld. So that is with obviously Hoffman. Now look over the Ramban. The Ramban writes his approach to Mishpatim and Chukim is along those lines, but slightly more expansive. Mishpatim k'mashma'on hadinim hamurim b'parshas ve'elim mishpatim uchalat Torah. That's why it says in regard to Mishpatim that you should live by them. Because these laws are given to govern that societies, countries should be able to live peacefully, that societies should function well. That people don't swallow each other up, obviously in dystopian, obviously in reality, that society doesn't break down. The idea of Chai Bahem is to ensure society. That's the famous thing about living by them and Pikuach Nefesh Doicha Shabbos and all them. It's the 3rd paragraph. V'da, this is a really key line in the Ramban. V'da ki chai ha'adam b'mitzvos kefi hachanasei lahem. And no, says the Ramban, this is a general rule, that the life of a person in the mitzvahs is according to hachanasei lahem, how much preparation he puts into them. Then he goes into a discussion of Shaloi Lishma and Lishma. You can do mitzvahs Shaloi Lishma that will give you reward in this world. And then you could do mitzvahs be ahava with love. You can do mitzvahs Lishma for the right reasons. V'chai b'hem doesn't mean in this world. V'chai b'hem really means in the world to come, you'll get olam haba. Again, on a simple level, the Ramban is telling us that the depth of the experience of a mitzvah and the power of the impact of a mitzvah is going to be in according to how much we fill up the performance of those mitzvahs with an understanding and a preparation and the framing of them in the right way. To conclude, let's just see something from Soloveitchik again on what is chukim and what is mishpatim. And really specifically, what is chukim? What is the definition of a chuk? So the chuk may be said to possess two characteristics. The first is its universal immutability. The fact that a chuk is independent of situational factors, changing philosophies or ideologies, or shifting practical and economic conditions. All these have no effect or bearing on a chuk, which persists and retains its values under all circumstances, at all times and everywhere. Obviously, only an absolute faith in God is the legislator of the chok can motivate such an acceptance. Meaning, why does the Torah have chukim? He's saying very simply, we need chukim because chukim tells us there's an immutability, that times change, things change, societies change. And it's interesting, arayos are already chukim. They're presented as chukim. Times have changed. Sexual morals have changed. Sexual ethics have changed. They're a chok. Yes, around you the world may change, but the idea of a chok is this. What it means, you can't comprehend it. On some level, that they're not, but we can comprehend. We do have reasons. But I mean, they're not comprehensible, meaning we can never rationalize them. We can never say, oh, they have this reason, they have this purpose, they have this rationale, and therefore, when the situation changes, when they don't fulfill the reasons, when they're not achieving what they were supposed to be, then we'll change it. No, chok means irrespective of the rationale, irrespective of the reason, irrespective of any purpose the mitzvah might have, it's a chok. You have to do it. All the same. He said, etymologically, the word chokak signifies the act of carving, engraving, making incisions in a hard surface, such as stone or metal. Several verses support this idea of chukim. Nature's laws are also chukim, it continues, unalterable and universal. The same legislator instituted both systems of law governing physical nature as well as man's deportment. The Bible uses the word chok in regard to nature, and it reuses chok in regard to our ethics and in regard to our mitzvahs. A little later, he says the second characteristic of the chok is its incomprehensibility. Its demand, the surrender of one's mind, and the suspension of one's thinking. It is a total commitment precisely because it requires an abdication of one's reason. The commitment of a child to his parents, however fervent, is not total. It is rooted in the family setting and has many qualifications and reservations. But a parent's commitment to a child, however, is instinctive and total. It is irrational and therefore not contingent or conditional. The reason for the chok remains a mystery. Indeed, the chok is often contested by one's thinking mind. Although man is a rational being, the chok demands that he violate his reasons. And then Soloveitchik goes on to say that really we have to perform the mishpatim, like we do the chukim. In our modern world, he writes, there is hardly a mishpat which has not been repudiated. Stealing and corruption are the accepted norms in many spheres of life. Adultery and general promiscuity find support in respectable circles. Neither murder, medical, and germ experiments have been conducted with government complicity. The Logos has shown itself in our time to be incapable of supporting the most basic of moral inhibitions. He says, even the mishpatim, which Rashi says that had they not been written, we would have known them anyway. He says that's not necessarily true. Societies of development, that what the Torah assumes is an obvious mishpat, an obvious law, is even that has become overturned. And therefore, the Torah insists that their mishpat be accepted as a chok. Hence, here the Torah interchanges it, both chukim and mishpatim, and then mishpatim and chukim, to equate the two. They're not two distinct realms. Chukim is actually the key. The key is the chok. What lies at the root of our relationship with the Kodesh Baruch Hu is the chok. The immutability and the incomprehensibility that Torah doesn't change. We have to keep it whatever may be. And the incomprehensibility, even if we don't understand it, even if things change, the reasons for things seem to be no longer in operation, they still the mitzvahs are still incumbent upon it. And therefore, the Torah insists that the mishpat be accepted as the chok. Our commitment must be unshakable, universally applicable, and upheld even when our logos is confused. Without chok, every social and moral law can be rationalized away, leaving the world in a sophisticated jungle of instincts and impulses. Even a mishpat can endure only when it is sustained by an unmotivated commitment, which is impervious to confusing circumstances. So again, the Torah says mishpatim and chukim, but really chok is key, and chok, the approach to chukim, even nowadays has to influence our approach to mishpatim. We don't have time to get to the Emek Dava. Those were a few ha'aris on this introductory piece to Parshas Acharei. Have a good Shabbos, everyone. All right.